Awesome. Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Car Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple, and I'm delighted. I've been so looking forward to this event, and now it's finally here, which I kind of can't believe, but I'm delighted to welcome Beth Winegarner for the release of her book, San Francisco's Forgotten Cemeteries, A Buried History. Let's give a hand for Beth. Beth is going to be joined this evening by Heather Bourbeau, who also has a new book out, Monarch. Let's give a hand for Heather as well. So I'm just the business guy. I'm here to tell you a little bit about bookstore business. I appreciate you all joining us both in person and online. We have a really active chat right now online. Hello, online people. I really am happy to see it. Lots of Writers Grotto folks saying hello. So I appreciate you all being here in person and online. We're broadcasting from San Francisco. We are on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land, and we hope that you join us in our pledge to turn land acknowledgement into action by donating either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear, or in my case, speak a land acknowledgement. Brief business. Now's a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. Please do check out our full event calendar on our website at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event that you are at right now. The restroom is behind us. It is available after the event and not during the event for obvious reasons. It's available to attendees of our event during event time. We like to keep it that way just because it's kind of the one place off the sales floor that my colleagues have that is off the sales floor and to themselves, so we try and respect that for them. But you are all guests in our house tonight, and we want you to be comfortable, so thanks for being cool about it. We appreciate it. We have books from both of our authors available at the front register. You can find them there. If you've been here before, you've definitely heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support the authors who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So if you are able, we always appreciate it. Thank you so kindly. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two writers who are joining us tonight. First, Heather Bourbeau's poetry and fiction have appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review, Kenyon Review, Stockholm Review of Literature, and others. A former journalist, she was a contributing writer to Not on Our Watch, The Mission to End Genocide in Darfur and Beyond, with Don Cheadle and John Pendergrast. Her collection, Some Days the Bird, is a poetry conversation with the Irish-Australian poet Anne Casey, and her latest collection, Monarch, explores overlooked histories from the U.S. West. Let's give another hand for Heather Bourbeau. And last but most certainly not least, Beth Winegarner is a journalist, author, essayist, and pop culture critic who's contributed to the New York Times, the New Yorker, Washington Post, Wired, Mother, and many others. She's a former daily news reporter for the San Francisco Examiner and a former contributor to the SF Chronicle. She is the author of several books, including Sacred Sonoma, The Columbine Effect, and Tenacity, Heavy Metal in the Middle East and Africa. Her newest book, San Francisco's Forgotten Cemeteries, is the reason we're here tonight. Please give another hand for Beth Winegarner.
So I thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you, Green Apple, for hosting. And I thought it would be nice if Beth could start us off with a small section from her book.
Thank you all for being here. The section I'm going to read is about the Masonic Cemetery, which was actually one of the closest ones to where we are right now, just on the other side of the park and a little bit to the east. The Freemasons, who established a lodge in San Francisco in 1849 on Montgomery Street in downtown San Francisco, purchased about 30 acres of the Lone Mountain grounds in 1854. Their plot was in an area bounded by today's Turk, Fulton, and Parker Streets, and Masonic Avenue, the last of which got its name from the cemetery. One of the dead laid to rest in Masonic Cemetery was James Reynolds Boyce. He was born in Portsmouth, Virginia in about 1829. He came to California sometime before 1860, when a census taker found him living in Campo Seco in the heart of Gold Rush, Calaveras County, working as a miner. He was living with a man called John Ryan, a fellow miner who was born in Ireland in 1826. By 1866, Boyce had moved to San Francisco, where he worked various jobs on the docks, longshoreman, stevedore, porter, while he moved around the city. Sometime before 1880, he moved into the What Cheer House, a men-only house once located at Sacramento and Leidesdorff Streets. The house didn't allow any liquor on the premises and also housed San Francisco's first free library and museum. It may have gotten its name from a friendly greeting common during the gold rush, in which people said, "What cheer, partner?" to each other. The house was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake. It looks as if Boyce never married or had children. He died on August 4th, 1881, from unknown causes at the age of 52. He was buried in the Masonic Cemetery. Between 1854 and 1901, when San Francisco stopped allowing burials, about 19,900 dead joined him. The Masonic Cemetery property, like the rest of Lone Mountain, was noted for its beauty as well as its views of the ocean and surrounding hills. The cemetery was, quote, laid out with walks and ornamented with shrubbery and monuments of exquisite taste. At the entrance, probably somewhere along Masonic Avenue, was a porter's lodge with a bell that rang out as funeral processions arrived. To the left of the entrance sat a pioneer's plot for early contributors to San Francisco. And in the center of the cemetery stood a fountain that was fed by an artesian well. The cemetery superintendents kept the burial grounds in splendid order, according to newspaper reports from the era. Quote, "The views of the ocean and coast range of hills from the western acclivity partake of the sublime as well as beautiful. Almost any clear day, and particularly just after a storm, the sound of the breaking waves on the seal rocks can be heard with distinctness in any part of the grounds." It's worth noting that the seal rocks, located just off the western shore, are more than a mile from Masonic Cemetery. San Francisco's human residents weren't the only ones to enjoy their time among the headstones on Lone Mountain. 2 black swans made their home in Masonic Cemetery in 1880. A pair of beautiful and perfectly black Australian swans have been received by John Gray, Secretary of the Harbor Commissioners. They are of more than average size and have been presented to him to the Masonic Cemetery Association to be placed in one of the 3 fountains in that cemetery. In 1887, the Masonic Cemetery Secretary predicted that there would be abundant room for burials for years to come. Nobody knew what was coming, that burials would soon be banned within city limits and the cemeteries would be evicted in the ensuing decades. Before the Masonic Cemetery began its move to Colma, 17 families whose loved ones were buried in the graveyard went to federal court to block the cemetery's removal. Their suit went all the way to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, but ultimately lost. The court approved the sale of the property in a 1930 ruling, rejecting the family's argument that ordering the removal of their loved ones' graves violated families' constitutional rights. The court noted, "The cemetery in question has been virtually abandoned. Its graves and tombs are neglected. It has been overgrown with rank vegetation. No funds have been provided by the lot holders for its proper maintenance, and there is no likelihood that such funds will be provided." Around 1915, the cemetery's directors, quote, made an appeal to the lot holders for an annual contribution for the maintenance of the cemetery. But the returns following such appeal were not sufficient to cover the cost of the postage stamps on the letters sent to the lot holders, let alone the cost of cemetery upkeep. On top of that, the lessons of the devastating 1906 earthquake and fires were still fresh in everyone's mind, including those of the Ninth Circuit judges. Lone Mountain cemeteries blocked many of San Francisco's major arteries to the Richmond district, where there were more than 100,000 residents lived by the 1930s, mostly in wooden houses built very close together. With the cemeteries in the way, firefighters' access was limited. When it came time to relocate the cemetery, Masonic officials reached out to everyone they could find who was related to one of their dead. They were able to match about 50% of the interred with living relatives, and only about half of those agreed to pay the costs of moving the graves. Historian Tamara Shelton attributed this to rapid population turnover that diminished the number of people who had a direct relationship with the dead. Families arranged to move about 5,600 of their loved ones to other burial grounds, mostly to Woodlawn Cemetery in Colma. That left roughly 14,300 in the ground. The Masons asked the city to extend the deadline for removals and won an extra 30 days. But the odds remained stacked against them. They sent about 5,000 letters notifying relatives and asking them to get in touch. About 2,500 of them were returned to the post office, which could not find their addresses. Ultimately, many of the Masonic cemetery's graves were reinterred in a common plot at Woodlawn, marked with a memorial to the San Francisco pioneers. Their headstones were used in various projects around the city. James Boyce's, now broken into several pieces, lines a drainage ditch in Buena Vista Park, along with many others from Lone Mountain's dead. The paving project was part of the Works Progress Administration's efforts to put people back to work after the Great Depression. Crews working on the ditch were told to place the gravestones face down out of respect for the dead, but they didn't do a perfect job. Some, like Boyce's, are face up and readable. Untold numbers of graves were left behind. When the University of San Francisco broke ground on its first major building in 1850, on land that once belonged to the cemetery, workers found at least 200 bodies after a backhoe uncovered a mausoleum. In 1966, during the construction for the university's Hayes Healy Residence Hall, the crew came upon so many bones and skulls that they refused to continue working until the human remains were moved from the site. It happened again in 2011, when excavation work began for USF's Center for Science and Innovation. Workers found 55 coffins, 29 skeletons, and several skulls. Given all these finds, it's likely that many more of the Masonic cemetery's graves remain in the ground, waiting to be rediscovered as construction comes and goes in this part of the city. Thank you. Now, the reason I asked Heather to join me tonight is because I discovered in the process of researching this book that she was working on a poem also about cemeteries in the Bay Area, and I would like her to read that now.
Yeah, we're going to nerd out on you guys. Black Friday. So this is from Monarch. It's overlooked histories from the U.S. West, not just San Francisco. Temescal Creek, small hill of tools, bulls, animal bones, ate and traded, honored life from the bay, mussels and oysters, clams and cockles, remains of ancestors. Flex the body, knees under chin, hands against cheeks, wrapped in blankets, buried with shells. 2,000 years, Lishon Oloni. Spanish came, ignored the mound. Spanish went, Gold Rush Drive, desolation, desecration. In 1853, across the bay, North Beach Cemetery removed, graves relocated, corpses heaped onto roadside, shoveled into carts. Shards of rotting coffins sold for firewood. At Yerba Buena Cemetery, body parts stolen to make soap. 1876, Centennial America, amusement park built on Emeryville Shell Mound. Racetrack and carousel, bowling alley and shooting range. Railway for easy access. Hilltop leveled for party pavilion, stairway to top, sheltered by cypress, views for partygoers dancing on graves. 1924, Prohibition meant sail, shell mound for Sherwin-Williams, lead-based paints, dry lime sulfur pesticides, mound leveled, soil choked on arsenic and acid. 700 remains found, moved to Berkeley campus, the foul and the sacred. 1999, new development, new discoveries, intact burials, men and women, limbs entwined, mothers and babies, bodies under stone mortar, bones rubberized by arsenic exposure, bones broken by backhoes, some shipped with toxic soil to Texas and burned, 300 bodies reburied on site of shopping mall. Now Ohlone Way and Shell Mound Street lead to movie theater and restaurants, Victoria's Secret and H&M, apartments and townhomes. Near Old Navy, Ersatz Creek and Shell Mound, sculpture of Ohlone basket, timeline of Ohlone history. But no sign to say you are walking over the dead. No way to know your complicity. Thank you, Beth, for being very generous and letting me read that on your night. So I know how I got interested in the Forgotten Buried in the Bay Area, but I was wondering how you got interested in it.
That's a good question. As Carr mentioned, I read a book years ago called Sacred Sonoma that I grew up in Sonoma County, and I began hearing stories about haunted places and things like that. So I wound up writing a book about weird places in Sonoma County. And living here, I felt like I wasn't as connected to the place. San Francisco is impenetrable in some ways. And at the same time, a friend of mine gave a talk about what are called corpse roads in the UK and Ireland. These were old pathways used for the pallbearers to bring bodies from the home to the churchyard for burial. And they had a lot of conventions and superstitions around making sure that the spirits could not get back home again along these pathways. So some of them crossed running water. Some of them were up weird steep stairways through rocky outcrops. And so I just got curious. I'm like, well, what were the roads to the cemeteries in San Francisco? I knew that we had some and they were all gone, or at least that's what I thought. So a historian friend of mine turned me on to California Digital Newspaper Archive, and I started looking at articles, and just one after another, it was like, yes, I found where the streets were that went to the cemeteries, but then I found over and over again that there was a cemetery, and then it was kind of moved, and then people forgot about it, and then they would start digging, and they would find the dead again, and because there was no institutional memory in those days, it would be like, why are we finding graves? Why are we finding skeletons? And there's been a lot of other research on this, but none of it was all in one place. And so I felt like it was a story worth telling for that reason.
Oh my gosh. And let me just say, I read this book. It sounds like I'm exaggerating, but it was a misfortune of reading this in Berlin, where nobody could appreciate all the amazing trivia I was learning about San Francisco. And I'm like, but wait, and everybody's like, whatever. Because you really will, when you read this book, it's so captivating, it's so well told, and you really do feel this different relationship with the city. And the other thing that came up for me was a different relationship to death and the way people would picnic at cemeteries, which I found fascinating. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that different relationship and what you found.
Well, specifically in the early part of San Francisco's history, people were just burying people wherever they could find space. People didn't even know each other. Um, the first cemetery was at Mission Dolores, which was an intentional cemetery, and is one of the few that's still there where you can visit graves, although there's like 200 headstones and 11,000 graves. So, but once the downtown area started being settled, there were just like little haphazard cemeteries, and then they would fill up and then they would move. But in about the 1850s, 1860s, this trend swept the nation called garden cemeteries or rural cemeteries. And so, San Francisco was like, well, let's have one of these. And that's what happened at Lone Mountain. It was like 170 acres of landscaping and paved pathways and streetcars that would take you out so you could go picnic on a Sunday.
People would court each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the same time, like we didn't have Golden Gate Park yet.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have Dolores Park yet. In fact, Dolores Park at the time was a cemetery. We didn't have these like big grand parks where you could get away from the downtown and go take in some nature. And like in the Masonic Cemetery, you could hear all the way to the coast. So it was a really nice escape for people.
Mm-hmm. Do you think people maybe also had a different relationship to death? Because in the 1850s, we had a cholera epidemic here. There was a lot of death.
There was a lot of death. I mean, that is what happened in San Francisco, is that so many people came here so quickly, and so many people died here, particularly without loved ones nearby. Mm-hmm. So they were just scrambling to create enough space to bury the dead. But you're right that death was more common and more out in the open, I think, in a lot of ways than certainly we have now. Today, if you want to, your loved one can die and they can go be in the morgue, and you can go online and arrange a cremation for them without ever seeing them, without ever communicating with the people who are handling them. I mean, everyone has their own choices, but it's very different today. Whereas back then, if your loved one died, you might put them in what was called the death room, now the living room, and lay them out so family and friends could visit before they were taken to the cemetery. So I don't think any way is better than the other, but certainly I think our predecessors were much more intimate with death than we are.
Mm-hmm. You talk a lot about the diversity of the population of early San Francisco and the different cemeteries and different rituals. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, for me, there's expected populations. We expect, obviously Mexican, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, but the Russians make their cemetery, and they have a plot too. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the differences and how people were allowed to have it at a time that I was not expecting city officials to be so open-minded with different death rituals.
I don't know that I for sure agree that they were as open-minded, but the reason that Russian Hill is called Russian Hill is because there was a Russian sailor cemetery at the top of the hill. It was not used for very long because the horses and carriages were tough to get up the hill. But what happened was, Mission Dolores started, and it's a Catholic-only cemetery. So if you came here and you died and you were not Catholic, you needed somewhere else to be buried. So there were sailor cemeteries and Protestant cemeteries and a couple of city-run cemeteries, which had all denominations of people, and particularly indigent people who died penniless in San Francisco, and the city had to do something with them. One of these was at what is now UN Plaza, not quite City Hall, but the Asian Art Museum, the main library, that area of the city. And then once that one filled up, which it filled up very, very quickly, they opened another one out near Land's End, where the Hidden Park Golf Course and the Legion of Honor are now. And most of those people were not moved because nobody had the money to move them. But the Chinese in particular, they did have their own burial rituals, and they had their own beliefs and ceremonies, and unfortunately they were made fun of a lot in the newspapers. That was really hard to see. And they were, again, pushed further and further to the edges of the city. And it was really unfortunate.
I mean, to me, it was really interesting because by San Francisco city law, restricted the Chinese population in terms of where they could live. And yet they allowed this, I mean, as the whole city was doing a constant expansion of grave sites. So to me, it was very interesting to see that push-pull relationship of somehow the dead in many ways getting more respect than the living.
Well, that's because the dead were being cared for by their own communities, and the living were not being well cared for by the city officials.
And you touch on it in the book, but can you talk about, for the indigenous population or Ohlone population, what grave sites were maintained, if any, in the city?
Well, I specifically do not go into that in the book because I feel like it's not my place to share where those places are. But again, the one exception is Mission Dolores because, I mean, first of all, the Ohlone were there first, and when the missionaries landed, they're like, oh, look, there are people here that we can get to do our work for us. And more than 5,000 of them died and were buried on that property and are still there. And I feel like that's important to point out. The curator there is a Ohlone man who built a replica of an Ohlone Thule hut in the cemetery, and there's a sign on it that says these people are buried on this property. So, yeah, I felt like that was important to talk about. But there are other sites. And remains are still being found occasionally, but yeah, I didn't want people to go looking for those necessarily.
Yeah. To me, one of the really striking things beyond the cocktail party conversation that you will have for years to come was the amount of research that you did, and I love a good rabbit hole. I'm wondering what resources you use, because you were able to get information off of partial headstones. So to me, that's an act of amazing research journalism goddessness. So
the main source, as I said, was like historic newspapers, but there were a few really great websites. There's a man named John Blackett, if you're here, please stand up, who has an amazing website called San Francisco Cemeteries. It just has like maps and locations and very, very basic details. There's another website that was run by a group called SF Genealogy. They've since taken all of their cemetery stuff offline, but they too had rough populations of dead in each of the cemeteries and boundaries and some newspaper articles that I didn't find elsewhere. But for something like James Boyce, I'm an avid user of Ancestry.com, census records and things like that. So I started with, if you look in the book, you can only see the last letter of his name is S, and then there's an R, and then Boyce, and it says Virginia, and then I think it says 1829. So that actually gave me a lot of information. Somebody whose name ends in S comes in. There was really only one person who matched all of those facts, so I was like, I'm pretty sure this is the guy. And he showed up in a lot of census records and other local records. So that gave me enough to try to put a story together.
Well, it's impressive because there are quite a few individuals that you dive into, and it just really brings it all together and makes it real in many ways. I know that sounds cheesy, but
well, one thing I want to say is like a lot of times the people I've written about in the book are the people that were found while construction crews were digging. So these are the found people, the identified people, and in some ways, like they're the lucky ones because we know where they were found, we know who they were. In most cases, we know where they got reburied to. But there are so many others that we're not going to be able to identify unless we find them and can figure out what plot they were in or what injury they had before they died, those kinds of things.
I'm glad you talked about the uncovering. At one point, you ask the reader and the world, I think, what should cities do if they uncover, remains during excavations?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to give anything away, but I'm wondering if you can talk about if your mindset has changed about what should happen or what you think should happen.
I mean, one of the things that comes up again and again in the book is that like the city is forcibly removing graves, and occasionally someone will say, this is desecration and it's against the law, and the city's like, too bad. Or just, other needs are more important than the dead. A little bit like now, city officials are still like, well, some things are more important than other things. And at first I wondered if like maybe they should all be moved, or could we somehow put all the memorials back? But that would be really awkward in like the library. So, and as I discovered that, for example, the U.S. Marine Hospital Cemetery out in the Presidio, this is a hospital where hundreds of sailors who came to San Francisco and died in the hospital were buried in this hilly area behind the cemetery. It was forgotten for decades. There was a tennis court put on it for a while. There was when they destroyed parts of Fort Miley, they put the rubble on this, like, they just called it a landfill for a long time. It has now been restored to its original sort of coastal sand dune environment, but there's also a viewing area with a plaque that says this is a cemetery. There was a researcher who'd gotten most of their names, and I think like it would be nice to have those names maybe, war memorial style somewhere on the property. But I like the idea that they're still there. The land has gone back to something else, but there's a reminder there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that in the city. There was a plaque, for example, outside what was Laurel Hill Cemetery, but unfortunately it was probably stolen about a decade ago. Like that could be returned at some point. Those kinds of things, just to let people remember.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the names are important as well? That concept of the third and final death is when no one remembers your name and says it.
Yeah. I get a lot of emotion just seeing the names of those people. And unfortunately, some of them it's like unknown or just an initial or something like that. And again, I'm talking about the sailors, but just having somebody's name, I don't know, you can get a sense of who they were.
Mm-hmm.
Part of me is, having lived in some other places, I'm very aware that it's also a point of privilege to even know that you're under these former cemeteries, because I've lived in places with real high concentration or conflict and post-conflict zones where things are just changing constantly, and you don't have time to sit with that knowledge, or crowding started hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's just such a privilege to have this book so that I know what I'm walking on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know what I'm walking on when I live in Berlin or Monrovia.
Well, I think in many how do I put this? Some stable urban areas, there's the opportunity to do this kind of work. I just read today about an art installation at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn where they have a lot of pauper graves and African American graves that are unmarked. And this artist came in and created pieces that sort of rememorialized the place. There's another place in New York, I think it's called Foley Square, somebody correct me, that has turned into sort of like a tiny little boxed-in park that's over a cemetery site.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, my partner has an ancestor who's under the Liverpool Street station in London because that's where that cemetery was and still is.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of cities, as they expanded, relocated cemeteries outside the city limits, which is why for in London, for example, you have Highgate Cemetery, which is sort of on the northern side of the city, or Paris did a lot of the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there's, in rural areas, you have a cemetery that maybe dates back a couple hundred years here in America, and it's still there. Maybe nobody goes there anymore, but it's not in danger of getting moved out.
I know that some of the reasons that people don't disturb the ground if it's been moved over are public health reasons. But at what point does that no longer, I mean, I don't know if you're qualified to talk about that.
I am not qualified to talk about it, but I do know there was a coffin dug up in that UN Plaza Yerba Buena Cemetery at the heart of the city, and they were able to find the burial records for the person and found that he had died of cholera. But some of the workers who dug up the grave convinced themselves that they'd gotten cholera from opening this coffin, which is not possible. Cholera was still going around at the time, so they probably got it somewhere else. But but by the same token, London still has maps of where all of the plague pits in the cities are, and when they were digging the London Underground, they made sure to dig around the plague pits just to keep from digging them open and risking anything coming out.
Yes, I am making notes for future poems. Oh my God. Plague pit maps, corpse roads. It's writing itself.
I can give you a bibliography later.
Oh, well, yes, please. Has your relationship to death changed after doing this research?
That's a great question, and I don't have a good answer. I think my relationship to historic cemeteries has changed. And I say that even my mom is buried in a historic cemetery, and I write about it in the introduction to the book. It makes me really sad that cemeteries could be forgotten. And I know that we as a Western European-ish culture have this weird idea that you should be buried in the ground and you should stay there forever and people should be able to find you forever. And that is not common across the world. But it's how I was raised, and it is nice to be able to go somewhere to either be with your dead or be with the dead of your place.
Mm-hmm.
And think about these kinds of things, because particularly in our culture, when you lose someone, you're expected to grieve for a week and then go back to life. And if you're still sad after that, then what's wrong with you?
Yeah. Do you think that? Well, now we're going to get deep, folks. Do you think that part of that is because, particularly, I think in the general U.S. culture, overall, we pretend death is something else, and we don't have it as a daily discussion. We don't normalize death. Everybody's going to go through it. Hate to break things, and yet we are defying it constantly, and even our language is about defying it. And we actually do put it away. We don't have traditions that have the dead body in the home for the most part. We don't allow people to have that kind of relationship with death.
I mean, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, where death was much more common, including among children. Oh my God, look at the headstones in a historic cemetery, how many children are there. And in a sense, it feels like San Francisco is extra able to avoid thinking about death because cemeteries are not on our paths of travel for the most part. And I'm sorry, I forgot the rest of your question.
No, that's fine. That's great. And then, what's your favorite tasty tidbit that you learned? Because I have mine, and Masonic is maybe second.
That is such a good question. I'm just gonna have to pick one because otherwise I'm gonna be sitting here all night. So one of the things that I write about, if you guys are familiar with the Magdalen laundries in Ireland, these workhouses for women, we had one in San Francisco, another thing not many people know about. There was a cemetery behind it where mostly nuns were buried. And I was able to get the disinterment record. Like, they had to disinter their people just like everybody else did. But I was able to find that there was at least one girl who was imprisoned there who was buried in that cemetery, but not accounted for in the disinterment. And I'm still wondering where she is. Like, was she just not written down when they were moving everybody, or is she still there? This is on the SF General Hospital campus, so I don't know.
Sorry, I have something in my throat. Thank you so much. I want to open it up to questions from the audience, and I'm going to drink some water.
Susan.
Hi, Beth. Well, congratulations.
Thank
you for writing this incredibly important book and doing this research. My question is, have there been resources for, if any remains are found during construction or something, to do DNA testing to see if there's any relatives or descendants that might be around or interested or able? I mean, I can't imagine who would pay for this, but just wondering if it's been used at all as a resource.
It's a good question, and one I have asked the medical examiner's office a lot. They don't do DNA testing. In general, what they do, in most cases, we still have fairly good plot maps of the city, and there are other researchers who have worked on getting those put back together. So, for example, if you guys remember the little girl who was found in the lead and glass coffin several years ago, who was buried, she was buried in the Oddfellows Cemetery with her family, and left behind in the relocation, and found when a family in that neighborhood was renovating something. So researchers were able to figure out, given her geographical location, what plot that was, and therefore who she was based on, and then they could find like how she died and figure out all those details. It's a bit of triangulation, like with Mr. Boyce. But yeah, DNA research is expensive, but using that kind of triangulation works pretty well, I think, a lot of the time.
Well, when they found whoever that was, were they then, I mean, do they then take the next step to notify any relatives or descendants or anything like that? Like, what if you're like, wow, that was my great aunt or something?
I mean, that's a good question too. know that they necessarily do that. I do know there's an archaeologist and planner working with the city, Carrie Herbie-Lentz, who also did a wonderful master's thesis on mapping the cemeteries and has created a tool internally in the planning department. So if you want to go build a building, they will tell you, well, there might be graves still under this property. And in their thesis, they were able to contact somebody, a descendant of somebody who was buried in Mission Dolores Cemetery, in the part that is now a playground for a Catholic school. And that person was like kind of meh on whether, whether it was worth knowing or not. But it's really up to like individual researchers to see if they can find those people or not. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, aren't for any new, I'm not sure if it's city, but I think for any new state and federal, you work with an archaeologist for any new construction. So if there are things found, particularly if they're from the indigenous communities, there's an act of repatriating or rematriating those artifacts.
Yeah, the laws I think are different for indigenous remains than they are for settler remains. I know settler remains for sure go through the medical examiner's office first. Like they have to make sure that this isn't a recent murder or something like that.
Right.
And then sometimes get held for a long time while they're trying to figure out, like, do we bury this person? Do I identify them? What do we do? So, yeah, there's many different processes, and I don't know all how they work.
Way back?
Yeah, I have a couple questions. They're very simple. First, thank you. I can't wait to read the book.
Thank you.
Was Laurel Heights a cemetery?
Yes, the neighborhood gets its name from what was called the Laurel Hill Cemetery. It was before that called the Lone Mountain Cemetery, but
So
yes.
that's part of Lone Mountain?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's a pretty good sized cemetery.
Yeah, it was, I think, 60,000 people.
Okay, and then what about McLaren Park? Was that ever a cemetery, do you know?
No, I don't think so. I haven't found anybody in that part of the city.
Okay, and then when you mentioned the new excavation at USF, where they, I didn't hear, what did they do with those bodies in 2011? They're the graves they found.
I don't know if I actually said, but I think that they would have gone through the medical examiner and then probably been reburied with the others.
Like in Colma? Or
yeah, that group grave in Colma.
And then, so then you said the Chinese were moved far out, the edges of the city?
Yeah, they were in City Cemetery, which is the one where the Lincoln Park Golf Course is now. If you go out there, there's still a big sort of gateway monument that was sort of at the center of where the Chinese burials were.
I had no idea that was part of the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tall man in the back.
I've always heard of San Francisco having moved the cemeteries out of San Francisco. I'm listening to you now, and I'm going, how much of them did they move? In all seriousness, was this a game of, oh yeah, they moved some so they could be visibly seen doing it, but they left half? I mean...
It looks like it was probably about 75%. I've seen numbers that say a little more than 200,000 people were buried here between the missionary period in 1901, and then about 150,000 were then moved to Colma. So, back of the envelope math suggests 50,000-ish. But again, and that, I don't think that includes the VA cemetery, for example.
Do you trust those numbers, or do you think they didn't even move 150,000?
I trust them because they come from researchers who have done a more individualized accounting than I have. So I think it's pretty close. But it's always, who knows? So many of the records were destroyed in the 1906 earthquake that to some extent it's a process of even rebuilding the information that we used to have.
In the last row?
So something like the columbarium, which I believe was in Oddfellows.
Yes.
The cemetery and then the columbarium around it. how did it end up staying here? I ask because my parents are at the Columbarium, so, you know.
Yeah.
And I don't know who they replaced when they got there. So how did that end up staying in, the regular burial around it left, but that structure?
You know, I have a section in the book on the columbarium, and I don't actually know if I addressed that particular question. That's a good question, but I think to some extent, because it was contained, it was allowed to remain. And also, that place was built in the 1890s, but then it was like
Abandoned.
it was abandoned for a very long time, and then restored finally in the 80s. So it's beautiful now. They're even expanding a little bit with more places
But they
to.
have nests and
Yeah.
raccoons. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And I'm doing an event there at the end of October. If anyone would like to come see it in person.
Thank you. So it's something in the book, which I should buy anyway.
Yeah.
You doing a reading there or something different?
A conversation with another cemetery author. It's called Why We Love Cemeteries.
Yes, sir.
Did you look into the justification for this moving? I mean, it's such an amazingly huge endeavor. Was it a justification for real estate expansion? Because other cities around the world and in the West didn't do this. I mean, as much as that. Or did they? And I'm just not aware of it.
Some of the big cities did, but like San Francisco is really unprecedented. Again, like 150,000 people is a lot of people to move. The justifications, I do get into that in the book, but they were kind of twofold. One was that because there was no money for upkeep, they were falling apart. And as people moved in, particularly to the Richmond district, they did not want to live next to a cemetery with like headstones falling over and graves blowing open in the wind and all of these kinds of things. They also were very worried at the time about like miasmas coming off of the cemeteries and blowing all over the city and making people sick. So germ theory had not quite caught up. Again, this is like the 1880s, 1890s, and they were worried that the groundwater would become contaminated, that people would get sick from living near the cemeteries, and just they were, ugly, and kids were playing in them and discovering bodies, and there was a lot of an ick factor.
Yeah. New York City famously did it as well. Relocated a lot, or just developed on top of a lot of cemeteries, and haven't been able to bury in Manhattan for over a century, I think.
Yeah, I think it might even be the 1860s or 70s.
Yeah, it's Queens. It's just all Queens.
Yes.
So first, super excited to get into the book. It sounds like I'll have facts forever about the city and learn to respect it in a new way. And I'm also really struck by the language of respect you use in referring to the people that have been buried in the city and what you will and won't get into from that set of principles. And I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit about what those guiding principles were. Is there a story that maybe you got into of an individual and said, I'm not writing about that? You talked about the indigenous population and not wanting to get into that because of a set of principles. So I'm just curious to hear.
It was really more, I didn't have any conflict with anybody. It was really more intuitive. Like I started to map those places and I was like, this doesn't feel like my story to share. And like Heather's poems talks about what happened in Emeryville with the shell mounds and all of that stuff. Like there are things that are public that we know about and we owe that respect. But I feel like what hasn't already been made public and exploited, like the indigenous community deserves to just keep that and make it public as they see fit. Yeah.
It seems to me that the economic argument for moving the dead is a weak one because of the cost of disinterring the bodies and, translocating them to Colma. And why was there enough perpetual care money in Colma to sustain upkeep.
Yeah, I mean, they sort of figured out that they needed to start new cemeteries and that the new cemeteries needed to have some perpetual funding in order to not have San Francisco happen again. And again, most of the money for disinterment and relocation came from the families or from the churches. The Catholic churches in San Francisco paid for quite a lot of relocations. But it's about who had the money and who didn't. The city notoriously would say, we'll give you X amount of dollars to move this, and then they wouldn't. And there's one case, I think it was when they were paving 16th Street, where Mission Dolores was like, we're going to keep these last couple of graves here until you give us the money, because we need the money. And the city was like, oh, fine. And they finally moved them. But you have these sort of corpse hostage situations to get the city to pay for anything. And again, I feel like we still have these kinds of things happening now. So.
Here's your next poem. Can you talk a little bit about Sutro? Just a little bit. Give these people a taste before we close out the evening.
Yeah, so Adolf Sutro, may have heard of him. He made a lot of money in the silver mines in Nevada. I came to San Francisco and started buying up property. He bought the Cliff House and turned it into this Victorian playland. He built the Sutro baths, and he built his fancy mansion and gardens at Sutro Heights. So he planted a lot of eucalyptus trees, among other things. But he was living next door to City Cemetery. He did not like it very much. He wanted to bring his own pleasure railroad out to his attractions by the sea, and started building a railroad through City Cemetery, through a fraternal organization plot. They went to court over it, but by the time the judge had issued an injunction, he had already laid the track through the graves, and then claimed he was innocent the whole time. He tried to fence off part of City Cemetery, claiming it was his land. And when the supervisors came out to say, what are you doing? He's like, I couldn't have fenced off that much land. There isn't that much land here. What are you talking about? And they said, Mr. Sutro, take the fences down. And then he tried to convince the city for several years to condemn the cemetery and sell it to the military. And they did eventually do that, which is how we got Fort Miley in the first place. But he died before the closures of the cemeteries, and he didn't get to see them move out of the city, which was sort of his dream as well as many other people's.
Yeah, to me, he was this weird mix of Don Quixote and Elon Musk.
Yeah.
He was very laser focused on the cemeteries in a very weird way.
Yeah. And when he died, his ashes were scattered at Sutro Heights. So, good enough for him.
Yeah. We have time for one more. Or Car?
Yeah, I have one from our online audience, which I think
is
good.
Great. Yeah.
Mary asks, so it sounds like this book better connected you to the city and its history and peoples. How does it feel when you're out and about and you think about the cemeteries as you go about your routine?
Well, I kind of I have to decide moment to moment whether to tell someone, oh, you're at the Legion of Honor today, and do you know there's dead people all over? And most people are really fascinated, which I hope is why all of you are here tonight. But once in a while, I feel like people maybe don't want to hear it. And my daughter, for example, she's like, Mom, don't talk to me about any cemetery stuff today. We're driving around the city, and I'm like, do you know what's over there? And she's like, stop. So yeah, I mean, it's made me kind of more of an insufferable nerd. But also, I do like knowing the sort of layers of what's going on in San Francisco. And maybe one of the best things about the book is that it's actually a great way to look at the history of the city as a whole. Just looking at how the development of the city affected the cemeteries and vice versa. I find a lot of histories can be a little bit dry, but told through something like this, it really comes alive.
We're here for all the time. Thank you so much, Beth. Many copies available at the front. Buy one for every member of your family and your friends. And thank you so much to Beth Winegarner.
Thank you so much. Let's keep it going for Beth Winegarner and Heather Bourbeau. Thank you both. This was very enjoyable. I so appreciate you spending time with us. And Heather, thank you for your questions and for sharing your work. And congratulations. Thank you for letting us celebrate. Thank you all for joining us as well. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you for all of your really great questions. All of you deaf nerds out there really love it. Heather did the best pitch, better than I could, about where books are and where you can find them. I am just here to let you know. I think, Beth, I'm gonna put you at the back desk here to sign books, if that works for you. So we can line up at the back desk, and books are at the front. You can bring them back here, and if you need to know where to go, I'll gladly tell you. And if not, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Yeah.